Thank you, Gretchen and Stephen. I have only a small question for myself. Which kind of legal vehicle did you have to use in order to implement your project?
You mean in China?
No, not in China, because China, life is easy in China.
Yeah, you convince the central government in China, and then things happen. Yes.
No, but in your case, when you started your activity, did you have to use a legal vehicle, or you did it on your own?
We established a partnership initially among Stanford University, together with two implementing partners, the Nature Conservancy and World Wildlife Fund.
So did you create a social enterprise?
We created just an MOU,
I see.
a Memorandum of Understanding.
Okay.
And,
thank you.
okay, and now it's all evolving quite a bit. It's likely to change to formally include many other types of partners.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have other question, but I have no. Please. And then.
The Global Footprint Network calculates that China uses about 2.5 times its ecological capacity to support itself, and that means that there are farmlands and extractive industries and corporations and rented farmlands, bought farmlands, and all over Africa, and to a certain extent all over Latin America. And this is a question which might be asked as well for the United States. I mean, how do you see a long-range future of this? China has doubled in population since 1970 and has tripled in consumption, and presumably is trying to get even higher in consumption. And of course, the restorative actions that you've talked about, which are so impressive, are taking place in the middle of all of that. So what's the future given the overused world and so forth?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And one of actually, I think, the most important, somebody said China is the 900-pound gorilla, and not, of course, just because of what's going on in China, but because of their influence that they have elsewhere. So one of the things I would hope, we haven't worked on this directly, but that I would hope is that you can apply the same kinds of tools and thinking about impacts, not only for what's happening within the territory of China, but thinking about the imports that are coming into China and what impact are they having elsewhere. But you're throwing up your hands.
Every time I say that to anybody, any government official from any country, they always go, ah! Oh. But that's right. I mean, that's what I preach all the time in China and Taiwan and generally, but it's very hard to get people to really do that. How much effort do we in the United States use to protect the sources of what we get? And China is much more on the make than we are. It's right, but undoubtedly what you said is correct, and it's got to be, but how do we get there?
Yeah, this is the thing that I worry about. So actually yesterday Jane gave a great example of progress in fisheries. There, the people who take the action, the suppliers and the beneficiaries in some sense are the same group. So you have some hope of fixing the economics there. Now you're doing something in China, or for the benefit of China, the local impacts. I mean, carbon, of course, is global, but the local impacts on biodiversity or the local impacts on water quality are going to be in that other country. Can you get people to have this broader, the comment that Gretchen made at the start of thinking about not exploiting the other? But.
Thank you very much. This is very interesting. I wanted to see whether I could connect your P, isn't it? GP to wealth accounts. So one thing, those who are not economists here, the idea is not simply to say how wealthy is the country. If you're looking for intergenerational distribution, you're interested in asking how wealth changes over time. Correcting for population, of course, conditional on population. So maybe you want to take a per capita view or something, but you want to look at the change. That the change in wealth is the same as saying net investment. That's because it's the stock which you're changing. So the GEP, is that a consumption of the services that nature is providing, or is it the consumption minus is it the net, see what I mean? I'm trying to connect it with the wealth accounting. And also with Mattis's work on, because there are similarities here.
Right. So one way actually of thinking about it, if we take this as a biophysical measure first, thinking about the stocks, now you're really onto the wealth accounting part, because now you're thinking about how are those stock of assets changing through time. Of course, as you know, the difficult part is we're going to have lots of different forms of stock, and are you going to try to aggregate them into a common metric, right? And so I think if you leave it at the biophysical, you can basically have a menu of stocks, and you can see how those are changing. You can also think about the flows of ecosystem services, and that's much more akin to the actual GDP and the income accounts. And in principle, one can think about valuing all those ecosystem services and thinking about integrating up through time the present value of those services and but that, I don't think we actually have the ability to do that at the moment.
Just for the sake of argument, you're using, sorry, can I just, this is literally a follow-up question and a very brief one, which is, suppose you did have the imputed values, just for the sake of argument, so you can do the aggregation. The figure that you have, is that the consumption of what the Chinese are consuming of their ecosystem services, or is it the total amount of ecosystem services that the Chinese economy is enjoying from nature? In other words, is it the supply or is it the demand? The GEP.
Supply? Okay. Yeah.
It's a supply.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
What is your idea about the genetic modified organism?
I had a good discussion following Professor Pingali's presentation this morning and Professor Raven's intervention, that I do feel overall that we're really limiting the potential for developing countries to address major problems of food security and nutritional security and some aspects of livelihood security if we reject all of that technology. I also agree that we have been modifying crops and other domesticated organisms for all of human history. We just use different tools over different periods of history. So from a point of view of being coherent in philosophical or scientific terms, it makes sense to consider potentially valid the most modern approaches. At the same time, I feel some of the technology, like these terminator genes and things that are used to trap societies into purchasing particular products and a dependency on particular corporations, that those really need to be examined carefully from ethical and economic and livelihood well-being perspectives. And I feel quite worried about the control that some corporations exercise over the rural livelihoods of millions of people. I also feel a bit worried about some of the potential ecological impacts of untested release of new types of organisms. So overall, I would like a more precautionary approach. But the bottom line is there's tremendous potential that we heard about this morning to improve well-being by advancing these approaches, and I feel it's mostly a matter of how we regulate their use. But others might have totally different opinions.
Just one sentence. The Terminator gene has never been commercialized or sold whatsoever, so it's a bit of a non-example. People talked about it once. I understand, but I'm just saying the Terminator gene.
Can I take you right back to the beginning of the paper? Because I don't have any quarrels at all with the last 2/3. There are always difficulties for any social scientist when the natural order is elided with the social order, and we're told this is the best of all possible worlds for both. And it came acutely home to me because there's something I've been working on here, which is when, right at the beginning, I don't want you to have to sort through those slides again, you were talking about the student folks, I guess, postgrads, who were told to take their little walk between the van and the forest and back again and do their tests. And that was summarized in a diagram which had a heading about psychiatric well-being. And clearly the implication was the two things underneath that heading, namely anxiety, bad thing, rumination, bad thing. My response is, why on earth? You two could not have given the presentation you have given without plenty of rumination. Which slides to select, which ones to reject, which order to present them in, how to do the division of labour, which is the most telling form of putting the argument over, because you've covered an immense amount of ground very well, but you couldn't have done that without thinking about it. Now, throughout the last 200 years, this term, this mental activity denoted in your diagram by rumination, has been known as all sorts of things. William James called it preparatory mediation or meditation. Charles Peirce called it musement. You call it rumination. I've written a trilogy of books calling it reflexivity. And the key argument of those books is very simple, or at least I'll simplify it for now, that the more complicated our societies and our lives become, such that you cannot just, engage by imitation of the community, your parents or anybody else, and you get it right. No, you actually have to think very hard about what your aims and objectives are, personally, then relationally, and then in even bigger relations, institutions, organizations, etc. But just as habit is no guide whatsoever to good, satisfying, sustainable action today in any domain, personal, right up to the UN, reflexivity becomes more and more imperative. So I hate to see it, squashed under a kind of deviant psychiatric condition. Have you got any comment on that?
Margaret, thanks for that. I wanted to hear all that you were saying, though at the same time I was tempted to interrupt to clarify one thing. I couldn't agree more with what you've just said. The clarification is that, at least in some areas of psychology, and I'm not a psychologist, I'm working with a team of psychologists there, rumination has a very specific, narrower definition, and it refers to sort of negative, self-referential, and repeated thought. And you ask people about it with questions like, how often do you think about all the stupid things you've done in life? How often do you remember that time when your love, left you for someone else? So there's specific ways to test people's tendency to ruminate. And the reason we got into that is that I mentioned there's a strong correlation between urban living and these various mental health disorders. And now the frontier is in identifying the causal mechanisms. And one of the causal pathways that is being shown by many groups potentially to be significant is the rumination pathway, defined as that kind of thought that I also engage in myself too often, but and that is known to lead to depression. And in fact, there's a part of the brain that lights up. If you have people go on a walk, normally if you bring people in from an urban area and you scan their brain, that part of the brain will have activity. And I won't go into the details, but then if you have half of them go on a walk and half in a natural area, half in an urban area, those that come back from the nature scenery have that part of the brain quiet, and it no longer lights up in the brain scanning, whereas those who walk on a busy street come back with it at least as activated as before. And that because that's known to lead to depression, and because depression is such a major problem now, there's a lot of research attention on this. But I completely agree with your broader comments, and I didn't know that narrow definition of rumination before I got involved with this team.
Can I just give Gretchen my definition of reflexivity in this trilogy? The mental activity of all normal people to reflect upon themselves in relation to their social environment, but it could be natural environment, it's actually in brackets, and vice versa. In other words, there's nothing self-referential about it. It's how to make your way through the world, quite literally. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Well, the challenge when you have a talk that covers so many areas, so many disciplines, is you're going to get those questions. This is a slightly different one. You began by dealing with the Taylor-Ricketts example of in Costa Rica, and showed the number of species, the different number of species that could be sustained. And included in that set was bats. And one of my colleagues, Peter Dasak, would throw up his hands in horror at the idea that you had a system that was so congenial to bats that it would bring bats regularly into contact with people and regularly into contact with livestock, given that something like Nipah virus was transmitted to pigs via bats nesting above a pigsty and so on. And Ebola was transmitted by bats so far as we best understand. So the question is the following. Given that in China, the whole of southern China is a mixing ground for viruses that cross species boundaries. And it includes highly pathogenic avian influenzas, it includes corona, it includes a variety of other diseases that have just moved through different species boundaries, and partly because of the changing structure of the landscape there. How do you deal with that? How does that get reflected in the assessment of the value of either the flow of services that derive from a landscape or the actions that have to be taken to mitigate the risks associated with those services in the landscape?
Okay.
I'll follow on Costa Rica, but you give
Okay.
it to
Yeah, so thinking about it in China, just more generally, here's one of the things actually that in doing this I worry about, and it actually comes back to, I thought, Margaret, you were going to go this way when you first started, but you ruminated on something else. But the point is that, you know, in principle, what we want to think about is you're comparing potential choices that you make, and you want to think about the whole set of consequences that follow from those choices. Now, that's in principle. In practice, of course, we only have information or only the ability to model a subset. So what are you leaving out? So right now, like in the work in China, we don't have a disease, a vector disease component on this. So, it could well be that in 5 years' time, after having done this modeling or the decisions that follow this, somebody will say, you have left out an important X, Y, or Z. And potentially disease vectors are an important one. In principle, I know what I would do, which is to say we would get people who understand disease vectors, how they spread, what is the ecology of those, how is that going to be influenced by the decisions that you make, and pull that in as another set of services, or the opposite of services. It's an additional cost. But in practice, then you have to actually do that, and you have to help pull in the expertise. And so in the back of our minds, always when we're doing these exercises, part of what's, at least for me, is what am I leaving out that could potentially be very important and lead me to a different decision? Because ultimately that's, we're trying to make better decisions that give us better results. So if there's something like that that potentially is decisive and we're leaving it out, then the next step is to try to bring that in. But
yeah, just two quick comments. One is, in looking at Gretchen's study early on of the walk in the woods, the first thing that came to mind was whether or not there was a gender difference in responses, and the second one was, did you require them not to wear headphones?
Those are good questions. Maybe you've had teenagers. I have a couple in my house right now. So we didn't observe gender differences. Good question. We did look for that. We standardized the people we were bringing in. They're all from urban environments and certain demographics. But we expect there to be likely significant differences among different groups, and that's one of the frontiers. Secondly, on the walks, we told them that they were meant to take photographs of anything that kind of caught their eye. And that was partly to maybe deflect them from divining what we were really up to, and also it helped prove that they actually completed the walk. They had to take a picture along the whole course of the walk as they went. So good questions there. And I'd love to follow up on this stuff after. I want to underscore just what Steve said, that we're just at the very tip of the iceberg, and it begs the question for the Chancellor and others, how do we cultivate awareness and maybe compassion for nature using this approach, and maybe the awe that we really only understand a tiny bit. Can we communicate this more effectively than we have so far, and engage people, and in education, getting back to what Partha was proposing early on? I feel like those pathways are really crucial in terms of driving action. And we've presented kind of a narrow slice through this, but I think we all hold in our minds a much broader vision of how we would cultivate change. And when I get back, Charles, my first thing is to go to a PhD thesis defense by a student who spent 6 years working on bat disease transmission and disease risk in this landscape. So yeah, we share your same concerns and interests.
Thank you.